My stepdad demanded I pay rent until I showed him the house deed with my name on it. I've always known this house is mine. Every creaking floorboard, every chipped tile in the bathroom, every faded mark on the wall where I measured my height as a kid, they belong to me. Not that anyone would ever say it out loud, especially not Rick. He moved in with us 4 years ago, and suddenly, he's acting like he built the place with his bare hands. "Turn off those lights, Alex. Electricity isn't cheap," he says, flipping the switch while I'm still reading. Or, "No snacks in the living room. House rules." His house rules. As if. Last week, he reorganized the entire kitchen without asking. Yesterday, he changed the Wi-Fi password and forgot to tell me until I'd already missed an online study session. And every single time something breaks, he stands there sighing dramatically, looking around at what he calls our home, like he's Atlas carrying the weight of the world. "This is our home," he always says. "We need to take care of it." Our home. I never correct him, but the words burn in my throat every time. Mom knows the truth. She knows whose house this really is. But Lisa Carter, my gentle, conflict-avoiding mother, never says a word when Rick goes on his power trips. She just gives me that look, a tiny flinch, a slight tightening around her eyes, silently begging me not to rock the boat. I don't hate Rick. Not really. He makes Mom happy, I guess. He's not abusive or anything dramatically terrible. He's just insufferable in his wrongness, in his absolute conviction that he's the man of the house. My house. So I stay quiet. I nod when he lectures me about leaving a cup in the sink. I don't argue when he complains about my music being too loud, even though these walls have heard much louder sounds from me since I was a toddler. I'm 17 now, practically an adult, and I can be patient, because there's something Rick doesn't know, something important, something that's written in documents locked away in Mom's filing cabinet, something that will change everything when the time is right. I see the way Mom tenses up whenever property tax season comes around, or when something major needs repair. How she finds excuses to check the mail before Rick does on certain days. How carefully she monitors her bank statements. She's protecting something, protecting me and what's mine. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty for the satisfaction I know I'll feel when Rick finally learns the truth. But then he'll do something like hang a hideous painting in the hallway without asking, and that guilt evaporates like morning dew. I'm waiting for the right moment. For my moment. In the meantime, I watch, I wait, and I silently count the days. Because sooner or later, Rick Thompson is going to discover that he's been playing king in someone else's castle. My castle. And I can't wait to see his face when he finds out. The last few weeks, Rick's been different. There's a new edge to his voice, especially when he talks about money, and he's been talking about money a lot. "Everything's getting so expensive these days," he'd say while checking the grocery receipts, eyeing me over his reading glasses. Or he'd mutter, "Can't just freeload forever," when I grabbed a snack from the fridge just loud enough for me to hear. Last Sunday at dinner, he launched into a whole speech about how adults all have to contribute while staring pointedly at me between bites of Mom's lasagna. I kept eating, pretending not to notice how his eyes lingered on me, how his implications hung in the air like cigarette smoke. At first, I thought he was just having a rough time at work. Rick manages a car dealership, and sales have been down lately. He doesn't think I overhear his late-night conversations with Mom, but the walls in this house are thinner than he realizes. My house, with its thin walls that have carried the sound of my laughter, my tears, my entire life. But then I started to see the pattern. How these comments always happened when I was in earshot. How they'd stop the moment I left the room. How he'd watch for my reaction out of the corner of his eye. He was building up to something. And tonight, it finally came. "Alex, could you stay at the table for a minute?" Rick's voice stopped me as I was about to clear my plate. Mom tensed slightly at the sink, her back to us, hands suddenly very busy with the dishes. I sat back down, something cold and heavy settling in my stomach. "Sure." Rick folded his hands on the table like he was about to conduct a job interview. "You're turning 18 in a few months. It's time you learned how the real world works." I nodded, face carefully blank. "Okay." We both know life isn't free. He leaned forward, that patronizing smile I've grown to hate spreading across his face. "Everyone who lives in a house has to contribute their fair share. That's why, starting next month, you'll be paying rent. The kitchen went silent except for the sound of running water and Mom's methodical scrubbing of a perfectly clean plate. She still wouldn't turn around. I should have been angry. Maybe I should have shouted or slammed my fist on the table, but instead, I felt something else entirely. A strange, calm clarity, like the moment before lightning strikes. This was it. The opportunity I'd been waiting for. I could feel a smile forming on my lips. Not a happy one, but the kind that sharks might give right before they bite. So you'll be paying rent too, right? The question hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. Rick blinked, his confidence faltering for just a second. What are you talking about? I pay the mortgage on this house. His voice had that adult tone, the one that says, don't be ridiculous without actually using the words. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture. Do you, though? Mom's hands stopped moving. The water was still running, but she wasn't washing anything anymore. Alex. Rick's voice had a warning note now. I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate being asked to pay rent on property that belongs to me. There it was. The truth, finally spoken aloud after years of silence. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rick laughed, but it sounded hollow. What are you talking about? I kept my eyes locked on his, ice meeting fire. Maybe you should ask Mom who actually owns this house. Rick turned to look at Mom, who was now gripping the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. Lisa? What's he talking about? The moment stretched between us like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. 4 years of pretending, of swallowing my words, of watching this man claim what was mine. It all led to this moment. And I was ready for whatever came next. I've imagined this moment countless times over the past 4 years. I've played it out in my head during boring classes, while falling asleep, during every condescending lecture Rick has given me about his house. But nothing compared to watching it unfold in real time. What are you talking about? Rick's laugh was sharp, forced, his eyes darting between Mom and me. Don't be ridiculous. This is your mother's house. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Are you sure about that? Something in my tone made his smile falter. His eyes narrowed, trying to read my face, trying to figure out if this was just teenage rebellion or something more. I pulled out my phone, opened the document I'd saved months ago, the one I'd photographed from Mom's filing cabinet when she wasn't home. I placed the phone on the table and turned the screen toward Rick. Mom finally turned away from the sink. Her face had gone pale, her hands twisting a dish towel like she was trying to wring water from stone. Rick stared at the screen, his expression transforming as he processed what he was seeing. It was a property deed with one name prominently displayed as the owner. Alexander James Carter. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming from across the kitchen. Rick's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. What kind of joke is this? His voice had lost its authority, replaced with something thin and uncertain. Mom said nothing. I watched her pull into herself, shoulders hunched forward, eyes fixed on the floor. She wouldn't be my ally in this moment, but she wouldn't contradict me either. She knew the truth. I kept my voice level, almost bored. It's not a joke, Rick. This is my house. Mom was only the legal guardian of the property until I was old enough. But the ownership has always been mine. Rick's eyes snapped to Mom, waiting for her to laugh, to explain that I was confused, to fix this impossible situation, but she avoided his gaze, studying the pattern on the linoleum floor like it contained answers to questions she'd been avoiding for years. I watched emotions cross Rick's face like storm clouds, disbelief, confusion, and then anger. But beneath it all, I caught something else, a flicker of fear. The foundation he thought he stood on was crumbling beneath his feet. No. His voice dropped, the word barely more than a growl. I don't believe this. I tilted my head slightly, the corner of my mouth lifting in a cold smile. Would you like to check? County records are public, after all. My challenge hung in the air between us. I could see him calculating, wondering if I was bluffing, trying to find some escape from the corner I'd backed him into. That's when Rick noticed Mom's silence. Really noticed it. His head swiveled toward her, his knuckles whitening as he clenched his fists on the table. Lisa. Her name came out like an accusation. How long have you known about this? Mom swallowed hard, her fingers working nervously at the dish towel. Rick, I just thought it didn't matter. I didn't want to complicate things. Rick shot up from his chair, sending it clattering backward against the wall. Didn't matter? Mom took a step back, her eyes widening. In 4 years, I'd never seen Rick raise his voice like that. Never seen that vein bulging at his temple. I remained seated, watching it all unfold with icy detachment. Part of me felt satisfaction, pure, sharp satisfaction that sliced through years of pent-up frustration. Another part registered something unexpected, a twinge of pity. Not for Rick, never for Rick, but for Mom, who looked so small and afraid in that moment. You've been lying to me for 4 years? Rick's voice shook with barely controlled rage, making me think we were building something together when all this time... He gestured wildly around at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. All this time I've been living in his house? I wasn't lying, Mom whispered, her voice trembling. I just didn't tell you everything. That's the definition of lying, Lisa. Rick slammed his palm on the counter, making Mom flinch. I stood up then, slowly, deliberately. I wasn't afraid of Rick. I never had been. But something primordial in me responded to his aggression, stood ready to meet it. Don't yell at her, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through his anger. This was between you and me. Rick turned to me, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. You've been watching me this whole time, haven't you? Laughing behind my back while I fixed your leaky faucets and painted your walls? I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just held his gaze steadily. I've been waiting for you to stop acting like you own something that isn't yours. I watched Rick's face transform as he processed what was happening. The initial shock and anger gave way to something more calculated. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling deliberately. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. But I recognized the danger in it immediately. So, you want to kick your stepfather out of the house, is that it? The question hung in the air, carefully designed to make me sound like the villain. Mom shot me a worried glance. I could read the plea in her eyes. Don't push this any further. Rick leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of wounded sincerity. Alex, I've been here for years. I've fixed the plumbing, painted the walls, taken care of this place. I've contributed so much to this family, and now you're going to treat me like a stranger? A small laugh escaped me as I stood up slowly. Don't talk like you paid for this house, Rick. You haven't spent a single cent on the mortgage. Rick's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but he maintained his composure. Family doesn't treat each other this way. His voice dropped lower, heavy with disappointment, like I was the one who had somehow betrayed our family bond, as if he hadn't just demanded rent from me for my own property. I placed both hands on the table, leaning forward to meet his gaze directly. My voice came out ice cold. Family doesn't charge each other rent, do they? Rick froze, the words hitting their mark. Mom's mouth fell open slightly, her eyes darting between us like she was watching a tennis match where both players had suddenly drawn swords. Yesterday, you told me I needed to pay to live in my own house, I continued, emphasizing each word like I was driving nails. Today, I'm just applying your rules. Does that seem unfair somehow? The calm facade Rick had been struggling to maintain finally shattered. He slammed his fist down on the table with enough force to make the silverware jump. You can't do this. I'm not going anywhere. Both of you, stop! Mom's shout cut through the tension like a knife. We both turned to her, surprised by the force in her usually soft voice. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, but her chin was raised, her eyes clear and determined. This is not how we're going to handle this, she said, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in years. We need to talk about this rationally. Rick let out a harsh laugh. Rationally? Your son has been plotting against me, and you've been helping him. I haven't been plotting anything, I said coolly. I've been waiting to see if you'd ever figure it out on your own. But you were too busy playing Lord of the Manor. Rick's eyes narrowed to slits. You little... Rick, Mom cut him off sharply. Alex is right about one thing. This house legally belongs to him. It was my father's last wish that Alex would always have security. And what about me? Rick's voice cracked slightly. Where's my security? I thought we were building a life together, Lisa. For a moment, I saw something unexpected in Rick's expression. Genuine hurt beneath the anger. It made me pause, recalibrating. This wasn't just about his pride. He genuinely felt betrayed. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy, but it was drowned out by years of resentment. You still could be, Mom said softly. But this conversation needs to happen without shouting. I'm not paying rent, Rick said flatly, looking directly at me. Not to a 17-year-old kid. And I'm not paying rent in my own house, I shot back. So it seems we're at an impasse. The kitchen fell silent again. I could almost hear the gears turning in Rick's head as he tried to find a way out of this situation. A way to regain some semblance of control. This is ridiculous, he finally muttered. I need some air. He stormed out of the kitchen, and seconds later, the front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Mom flinched at the sound, then sank slowly into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Did you have to do it like this? She asked without looking up. I sat down across from her. How else was I supposed to do it? You weren't going to tell him. She raised her head, her eyes tired. You could have waited just a few more months until you turned 18. We could have handled this like adults. He wasn't treating me like an adult, I pointed out. He was treating me like a child who needed to learn a lesson about the real world. Mom sighed. You don't understand what you've just done, Alex. Something in her tone made me uneasy. What do you mean? The kitchen felt like it was shrinking around us. Rick stood by the counter, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his face flushed a deep crimson. Mom's eyes darted between us like she was watching a bomb that might explode any second. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to find words that might diffuse the situation. I sat back down at the table, deliberately calm. I took a slow sip of water, then set my glass down with a soft clink. I knew I had the upper hand now. I just needed to wait for Rick to finish self-destructing. You have two options, Rick, I said, my voice measured and clear. 1, you sign a rental agreement and pay rent like anyone else living here would. 2, you pack your things and leave my house. Rick let out a scornful laugh, but it sounded more unhinged than confident, the laugh of someone trying to deny reality. You've got to be kidding me. I just tilted my head slightly, raising one eyebrow. Do I look like I'm kidding? The silence stretched between us, taut as a wire. Rick's hands curled into fists at his sides, then uncurled again, as if he couldn't decide what to do with them. You think I'm going to let some kid kick me out of this house? Rick's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. I've lived here for years. I've taken care of this place. I have rights. Rick, don't... Mom started, her voice trembling. Lisa, you're not saying anything? Rick cut her off, his voice rising again. I'm your husband. Are you going to let your son throw me out on the street? Mom opened her mouth, but I raised my hand, signaling her to stay quiet. Mom doesn't need to say anything, I said calmly. This is between you and me. For the first time, I saw recognition flash across Mom's face, the realization that her son wasn't a child anymore, but the person controlling the situation. There was something like both pride and fear in her eyes. I smiled slightly as I stood up and walked slowly toward Rick. I'll say it one more time. If you want to stay here, you'll sign a rental agreement. If you refuse, you can leave right now. I stopped a few feet away from him, looking directly into his eyes. The choice is yours. Rick completely lost it then, slamming his palm on the counter with enough force to make the dishes rattle. You can't do this to me. I'm the adult in this house. You're just a spoiled brat. I didn't flinch, just stared at him like he was a wounded animal thrashing in its final moments. Go ahead and try me. Starting tomorrow, I'll change the Wi-Fi password, freeze all of Mom's credit cards, and if you refuse to pay rent, I'll call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Rick went suddenly silent, his mouth hanging open mid-rant. Mom gasped softly from the table. Something changed in Rick's expression as he realized I wasn't bluffing. The anger remained, but now there was something else. A dawning comprehension that he had completely lost control of the situation. You wouldn't dare, he finally said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Wouldn't I? I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts. Should I call them now and get it over with? Alex, please, Mom interjected, her voice strained. Let's all take a breath. Rick, she turned to him. He's serious. The house really is his. My father left it to him, not to me. Rick looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Why? Why would he do that? Because he didn't trust me with money, Mom said quietly. He knew I would always choose people over security. The implication hung in the air between them. Rick's shoulders slumped slightly. He looked around the kitchen, at the walls he'd painted 2 years ago, at the new cabinet handles he'd installed last summer. I could see the realization washing over him. None of it had ever been his. So what now? He asked, his voice hollow. I just become your tenant? Pay rent to a teenager? That's option 1, I replied coolly. And if I refuse? I shrugged. Then there's the door. He looked at Mom, waiting for her to intervene, to take his side, to offer some compromise. But she just stood there, torn between her husband and her son, between her present and her past. You have until tomorrow to decide, I said, picking up my glass and walking toward the doorway. I paused, turning back to face him. I'll even be generous and give you the friends and family discount. 10% off market rate. As I left the kitchen, I heard Rick's bitter laugh behind me. Like father, like son, huh, Lisa? I froze mid-step, my back to them. That was new information. I'd never known my father. Rick staggered backward, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. His eyes darted around the kitchen as if searching for some escape route, some way to salvage what little dignity he had left. He let out a bitter laugh, though it was hollow compared to his usual confident chuckle. You're going to regret this, kid. I shrugged, my voice casual. Maybe, but I don't think so. Rick turned to Mom, his last desperate attempt to find an ally. Lisa, I'm your husband. You're not going to do anything about this? Mom looked at Rick, then at me. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the years of avoiding confrontation, battling with the reality of the situation. She swallowed hard, then let out a long sigh. Rick, you should go. Rick's eyes widened in disbelief. You're choosing him over me? Mom's eyes glistened with tears, but for the first time I could remember, she didn't back down from the truth. You were wrong from the beginning, Rick. The words landed like a physical blow. Rick's face went slack as the full weight of his defeat sank in. He stood there, mouth slightly open, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall, counting down the final seconds of Rick's time in our house. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. Mom and I remained where we were, listening to his heavy footsteps up the stairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing, items being tossed haphazardly into a bag. 10 minutes later, he came back down, a small duffel bag clutched in his hand. He paused at the door to the kitchen, as if waiting for one of us to stop him, to call him back, to offer some compromise. Neither of us moved. With a final glare that tried but failed to mask his humiliation, Rick walked to the front door. The sound of it closing behind him wasn't the dramatic slam I'd expected, just a quiet click that somehow felt more final. Silence settled over the house, our house, like a blanket. Mom turned to me, tears streaming down her face. You've really grown up, haven't you? Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, just nodded once. What was there to say? Everything had changed in the span of an hour. The secret I'd been holding close for years was now out in the open, and the man who'd been playing king in my castle was gone. I walked into the living room, looking around at the familiar walls, the furniture, the pictures. For the first time in 4 years, there was no Rick sitting in the armchair by the window, no Rick dictating what channel we'd watch, no Rick setting arbitrary rules about where we could eat or when the lights needed to be turned off. It was just me and Mom now, and I was the one in charge, not because I demanded it, not because I forced my way into that position, but because it had always been that way, ever since my grandfather had left this house to me. I ran my hand along the back of the couch, feeling the fabric beneath my fingers. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different. Lighter somehow, as if the house itself could breathe easier. That's more like it, I said quietly to myself.